This is episode 41 of Upshift, a history of Essence20. Upshift is an No Direction Network podcast that gives you an edge on Essence20, and I'm Ryan Costello.
And I'm Charles Cushman.
Before we begin, although I have worked for Renegade Game Studios on Essence20, Upshift is not associated with or produced by Renegade Game Studios. This is not an official Essence20 podcast, and all opinions shared herein... I should not have picked up my tea like I was anticipating the sip, and I can just imagine the viewers were also anticipating that sip. Let me finish my preamble. And all opinions shared herein are our own. Charles Essence20 turned 3 years old this year, sort of. So I thought we'd look back through its development, its release, and its future. Now, the last time we recorded, it ended up being this 2.5-hour behemoth. The good news is, I just dropped off my daughter at gymnastics, and I cannot be late picking her up. So we do not have 2 hours to just go on tangents about G.I. Joe and whatever we love so much about it. We got to be tight in and out. We have less than an hour to record a half-hour podcast. I think we can do it.
Okay. Well, I don't know anything about the first 2 years of Essence20, so I'm excited to learn quite a bit in this particular set of questions. So let's get down to it.
Excellent. That was one of the reasons I like this topic for one of your first episodes, is that you'll get caught up on a lot of things that will just be kind of like subtextual to me when we talk about things we relate to Essence20. The downside of this episode is I don't know how much talking you're going to be doing, so we'll see how this plays out. Anytime you feel like I've talked too long, you just say, I have a point, or something. I will try and give you as much room to share your thoughts as I can.
Maybe we can start out with, what the heck is Renegade Studios? I absolutely have, until this particular book came up and I purchased it and looked at it, I'd never heard of Renegade Studios. Then I went to the website and they owned everything I love. So how exactly did that come about?
All right. Well, Renegade Game Studios has been around for about 11 years now. It was started by Scott Gata. So prior to that, Scott Gata was the chief operating officer and the co-founder of Cryptozoic Entertainment, which is another tabletop game publisher that deals in a lot of licenses. In fact, unless I'm mixing up my companies, Cryptozoic made this Justice League Meeples set that I happen to enjoy very much. I'm holding them in so that they don't fall out. But yeah, Justice League Meeples comes in a Hall of Justice case. There was a whole blind bag set. That was in Board Game Bento, which is a board game subscription box that I was curating for a while. And I don't know what happened, but they released it and then almost immediately lost the license. And so they were contacting me like, hey, we have 2 months that we can still sell this. Can we put these in one of your boxes? Which, our game, because we could have asked basically for the lowest price possible. They put all their cards on the table. So anyway... Actually, Scott was probably associated with Cryptozoic at the time, although I didn't meet him through Board Game Bento. So in 2014, he left Cryptozoic, he was bought out, and I'm not sure the details, because, I didn't know him and I was not privy to the negotiations, but I know that one of the caveats of his buyout was that he kept the rights to publish a game called Gravwell that they signed for their tabletop division. And again, I don't know if Gravwell was signed and then they weren't doing anything with it, or if it was just something that he thought could be a game that could launch his company. But for whatever reason, he left the company, kept the rights to Gravwell. Gravwell was the first tabletop game that Renegade published, and it was very successful for them. Gravwell is this cool space racing game around a black hole, and so every turn you go as far as you can, and then the black hole sucks you in and it messes up your position in the race. But you can try and manipulate where you are so that you get moved to an advantageous position. So that kind of set the tone for the kind of games that Renegade liked to put out. They were smart, they were fun, they were thematic. And they continued to put out games like that for the next few years, and they continue to do so. They never left the tabletop gaming space. There is one game that I wish I could remember the name of. I own this game, and it is basically you cast spells by creating puns, and you kill monsters with your puns. And is it Spell Smashers? No, I am going to have to look this up for the show notes. But yes, this is obviously a game that I love very much, and it was one of the first Renegade games that I bought completely divorced from Board Game Bento, although we did include a couple of Renegade games in Board Game Bento. Now, a couple of things changed a few years into Renegade's existence. First of all, they got the license to produce some Power Rangers tabletop games in 2018, and that started with the miniature skirmish game, Heroes of the Grid. And there was one other board. I think it was just a Power Rangers board game. But anyway, this was the first contact between Renegade and Hasbro. They licensed Power Rangers, put out some games. Heroes of the Grid was actually extremely successful. It went to Kickstarter, exploded really big, and so they released expansions for it. Couple of years, 4 years, up until this year, they had their last expansion come out. Or they sold their last expansion. I don't know if it's officially out yet. The other thing that happened in the first few years of Renegade, in 2020, they worked out a deal with the owners of the World of Darkness license, which started with White Wolf, but was with Modifius at the time, I believe. No, Paradox. So Paradox gained the rights to the World of Darkness, so Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Gathering? No, it's Magic the Gathering. Werewolf the Hunger? Werewolf the something. Anyway, Vampire the Masquerade and the associated titles. And
Maybe
they...
the Ascension. Don't forget that one.
So I don't want to get into too much detail because I don't know exactly what they have published under World of Darkness. And I don't want to say something out of ignorance that somebody, knowing that I've worked for Renegade, might mistake for being like inside information. So I'm just going to be vague that they are working with the license holder of World of Darkness to create expansions for World of Darkness. It's a very strange setup in that the primary the rights holders produced the core rulebook, and then Renegade has been developing the supplements. So this was kind of the first touch of they are producing games for a company that could be producing games themselves, which brings us to Hasbro. So I'm not going to go through the whole history of Hasbro, but I can tell you that they are a toy company. They own major licenses, some of the most recognizable in the world. I would say that after Disney and Warner Brothers, Hasbro may have the most recognizable North American intellectual property of all entertainment companies. And it helps that they have bought up a lot of other companies that were producing toys in the 80s. And so some things that weren't Hasbro's, like Power Rangers, like Mask, GoBots, basically everything that's not owned by Mattel is most likely under the Hasbro license now. And in 1999, they acquired Wizards of the Coast, which was the publisher of Magic the Gathering, was and is publisher of Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons. And it became like just a real powerful partnership between company and subsidy. And, over the years, sometimes Wizards of the Coast has produced some games related to Hasbro IP, but more often Hasbro has licensed their properties out. Now, the big question that always gets asked about the Essence20 games and why Renegade is publishing role-playing games based on Hasbro IP when Hasbro owns the publisher of the best-selling role-playing game in the world, and I don't know. That is still a question that baffles me to this day. I have a couple of theories. Actually, would you like to take a stab at why you think Hasbro would rather lease out their properties rather than take a stab at them themselves?
Well, I have absolutely no industry knowledge about such things. However, from the rumors that I've heard, Hasbro is about the size of a government now. And owns everything. And thus, it's really hard when you are as large a company as it is to get product out quickly and to innovate. And so when you need innovation and you have IP, why not get the people who move quickly, produce quick products, know how to fund them, know how to drum up the interest in them, and then have them make the best use of your IP? You don't have to do pretty much anything other than write a licensing agreement, and then the checks go rolling in. So I think that they're moving away from a toy company and a game company and becoming an intellectual property company that makes movies and has people make games for them and things like that. So, and I think that's a good move for them because you don't have to worry about production issues and details like that. I'm interested in your theories, though, because they'll probably be at least a little more informed than mine.
Well, I have two main theories, and again, I am not coming from a place of inside knowledge other than having worked in the industry. So one of them kind of is adjacent to yours. It cuddles up to your theory, and that is that it relates to something that Eric Mona once said about the Alternity role-playing game. This was a game put out at the end of TSR, just as TSR was acquired by Wizards of the Coast. It was a science fiction standalone role-playing game. It was kind of pitched as Dungeons and Dragons in space, and there were some mechanical similarities, but like there was no connective tissue beyond that. Alternity was released. It was out for a couple of years, had a couple of supplements, and then went away. And Eric Mona said that every other publisher in the industry would have killed for Alternity's sales numbers, but by Wizards of the Coast standards, it was a failure. And so I think that might be one of the things that Hasbro is looking at its IP, looking at how much money it can generate, how much time and effort it would take to generate that money, and say that is not worth our time. But somebody just giving us money and we take no risk, that is worth their time. I said we a couple of times in there. I don't work for Hasbro. But yeah, from Hasbro's point of view, somebody else taking on the risk and paying them money to do so, that is worth it as long as it doesn't cannibalize sales of Dungeons and Dragons, which I don't think Essence20 does. I think that the selling point of Essence20 is these IPs, and that anyone playing Essence20, odds are is already a Dungeons and Dragons player or has a reason to not be a Dungeons and Dragons player. Either way, I don't think Hasbro is losing customers to Essence20. So that's one theory. The other theory goes back to the G.I. Joe trading card game, which was put out by Wizards of the Coast. And it was out for 2 sets. There was a third set that was all but ready to release and then was canceled. And I wonder if Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro don't like the idea that they are working together and fail at something that is totally in-house. And it, companies those size have failures all the time, and they are able to absorb them because of their successes. But I just don't think it feels good or looks good. Like, the optics aren't good when they fail combining two of those things that they're supposed to be good at.
That's interesting. I would add, I think, perhaps one more thing strategically. I think from a company that size with an IP worth that much, anything that keeps it in the public consciousness is probably a good thing, because there's a lot of niche stuff that's coming out, collector's stuff, the classified that we talked about just the other day, and but that's not necessarily bringing kids and new players in. Whereas Essence20 is completely, there isn't an age group that really can't play it, and it can create the kind of connections that role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons do. So it does help prime that next generation to actually love the IP.
In a lot of ways, a role-playing game is an evolution of toy playing. You are playing pretend, you are taking on your main character, and then, populating a world around you. And so the idea that some people our age don't all collect action figures, even if they still consider themselves a fan of those properties, but this is a socially acceptable and space, the space it takes up is a lot more it takes up less space. I don't know why I'm trying to say that in some clever way. It takes up less space to still have all your imagination come true in the games of play. So I do see what you're saying there. So that brings us to the earliest era of actual Essence20 history, and that is what I am calling the 5e era.
Interesting. Why would you call it that?
In September 2020, it was announced that Renegade Game Studios had expanded its licenses with Hasbro, gaining the G.I. Joe, Transformers, and My Little Pony licenses to go along with the Power Rangers license they already had. And there was an announcement that there would be a Power Rangers role-playing game in development, and it would be based on 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Now, as somebody who's not associated with this company, but in love with those brands and role-playing games, I read every bit of news that I could about this, because it seemed so specific that they were not saying there was a G.I. Joe, Transformers, and My Little Pony role-playing game in the work. All of the news articles covered it, said specifically, it covered it in 2 sections. There was here's the new IP they can make games about, and there is a Power Rangers role-playing game coming out. So I took my shot. I put together a resume. I said, I know G.I. Joe better than most people. I know role-playing games very, very well. I think I should be working on this role-playing game if there is a G.I. Joe role-playing game in development. And as it ends up, there was. The plan was the original plan was very similar to what turned out with Essence20, and that is that they would release these 4 IPs, all of which would be a standalone setting, all of which would use the same mechanics, and all of which would be, the cross-compatibility would be part of the marketing. The big difference between then and now is that the plan was it would be based on 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. And for people that aren't into the design side of this, Dungeons and Dragons would be the engine. It would not necessarily be a medieval setting. It would not have to have dragons and whatnot. It's just that the rules that run that game would have run our game as well. And there is, even if we weren't licensing these Hasbro properties, we would have had the right to do that because at the time there was an open gaming license that would allow us to use the mechanics that were developed to make 5e run. So the original plan was for, I believe Gen Con 2021 would see the release of G.I. Joe, Transformers, and Power Rangers, and My Little Pony would be held on to for a little bit longer than that. Now, you know what? I want to take a step back because there's something I recently learned about the prehistory that I did not mention now, and I just got reminded of it. So on the Renegade YouTube channel, I recently saw something posted by Anais, who is the social media manager, and it was a clip from Gen Con. I don't know how I hadn't seen this before. It was from Gen Con a couple of years ago, and she was just going around the Renegade booth, and any product she would pass, she would talk about its selling points. And she came across the Field Guide to Action and Adventure, which is the big crossover source book, and she threw out there that this was the book that got Hasbro to agree to the licensing, that the idea would be that there would be this crossover book, and that was part of the original pitch. And she said 10 years ago, which would be 12 years ago now. And I think she might have just thrown that number out there because she was dealing with a lot of things and she just needed a number because 10 years ago, or within those 10 years, another company had the rights to the My Little Pony role-playing game. So I don't think that number is right, but it is interesting to hear that the idea of cross-compatibility it wasn't just going to be separate source books, there was going to be a source book dedicated to it.
And that is what happened.
It is, but we did not use 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Now, again,
and so
go ahead.
What happened there? I mean, it's not like a rights issue because we're talking Wizards of the Coast, which of course is Hasbro. Why did you not?
So this is second, third-hand information and a little bit of stuff that is under NDA. So I cannot go into details. I can't answer follow-up questions. All I know is that the person who was in charge of the 12-person team that had been assembled for these for the first 3 of the core rulebooks, Elisa Teague, she would meet with Hasbro, tell them how the licensing, like with the licensing people, tell them how the development was going, and she just got a vibe anytime that she brought up that it was going to be based on 5th edition. And I have a couple of theories about that. One could be that these are licensing people, so they might hear Dungeons and Dragons and picture that we are making Dungeons and Dragons Transformers and Dungeons and Dragons G.I. Joe, and they weren't so sure about it, but also not so against it that they would say anything, so maybe the vibe was real. There was also the fact that a couple of years later, that 5th edition refresh that came out, the 2024 version of Dungeons and Dragons, might have been in early development, and these licensors maybe knew about it, and maybe knew that if we were putting out a 5e compatible book right before that change, it could mess us up, but they couldn't tell us, and so maybe the vibe was real there, or maybe there was no vibe, and Elisa just picked up on something that wasn't there. But in any case, she went back to Renegade, told them her concerns, and said, we should shift gear, we should make this an original system, and that way we will never have to worry about what happens with the licensors and what happens with 5th edition.
Interesting. So from that was the genesis, but how did you actually get to, when you being the greater you, how did Renegade actually get to the Essence20 system? Was it based on something else, or was it just cut from whole cloth?
It was cut from whole cloth, but the hope was that it would still have enough similarities to Dungeons and Dragons that if this was somebody's second role-playing game, there would be a lot of jumping on points. People would recognize it's a 20-level system. It's more or less run by classes, even though we don't call them classes and whatnot. And it would not be a heavy lift to learn this new system if your only exposure to role-playing games was Dungeons and Dragons. Now, when most of the team found out that we were making this shift, Brian, one of the designers who was technically on the Power Rangers team, came in with a new core, the spine of a new system. And so the steps that it must have been would have been Elisa talking to Hasbro, Hasbro's concerns. She talks to Renegade. They approve starting like extending deadlines, starting a project on a totally new design, and then contacting Brian and getting a design so that we have a jumping off point for where we go. But other than that spine, it was wild. It was the wild, wild west of game design. I have never been on a project where that worked like that, because it really was like, if you had an idea and you took initiative, odds are your idea would get approved, it would get incorporated into the whole, and then everyone would work off of that. And, you know, not every idea was accepted, but we were a group of experienced gamers, experienced game designers. And so knowing what we had and knowing what we had to get to, a lot of times we would just say, like, this is an issue with the system. Here is how I think we should solve it. Like, it was rare that you brought up an issue without a solution for it as well. And I will just, you know, compliment myself and say that if somebody else brought up an issue and they didn't have a solution, I would usually take that week, focus on that problem, and come with a solution to the next week's meeting. But yeah, a lot of things were just like getting pitched and approved and incorporated very quickly, and it was really just a fascinating process. And all three of the games that we were developing, obviously they had a lot of similarities, but they also each had their own individual needs. And so, you know, if like Power Rangers did their roles first, which we didn't have a name for yet, and I'll get to that story in a second, but Power Rangers did their roles first, and so then when the G.I. Joe team, got to the time to design our roles, we used their template, and we knew to build it out. We knew that we had to do the presentation of like 3 bullet points with a couple of paragraphs explaining what that bullet point means to that role. And yeah, like the format of the book and the organization of the information gradually came, and it tended to trickle down from Power Rangers to G.I. Joe to Transformers.
There's some distinct differences, though.
Distinct differences in that they have needs of the setting. So Power Rangers obviously
between
need
it.
the Zords. Oh, sorry.
Between it and Dungeons and Dragons, you said there was enough similarity, but there are some very distinct differences.
Okay, why don't you cover the differences that you see?
Number one, you don't crit on the roll of the 20, but it's the use of all of the dice.
Yes.
It's one of the few systems where you ever consistently roll the whole mitt full of dice that you get when you buy a set of dice. And I guess what drove it down that direction? Because it's interesting. It's also fairly unique as far as I understand it.
Yeah. So 2 things I'll say about that. One was that one of the similarities we wanted with Dungeons & Dragons is that we wanted to use the same dice, and that way we could sell the G.I. Joe dice, the Power Rangers dice. And if you weren't playing our game, but you were playing Dungeons & Dragons and you just wanted a set of Red Ranger dice, you know, that was also an option. But the core idea of rolling a d20 and your skill die, that was the spine that Brian brought to the game. So he knew the resolution mechanic would be d20 plus skill, and that we would never have math. You would only ever have to add 2 dice together. So when you gain an edge and you're rolling 2d20, you only have to worry about one of the 2. When you get your specialization, which was also something that came with the spine of the system, you would roll them all, but then you would just take the 2 that you want to add together. So we wanted to make it a very math-light system, and that is where the idea for Upshifts came from, because I don't believe that was part of the spine of the system. I remember that being something that Paige, one of the designers on the G.I. Joe book, that she came up with, that instead of giving a +1 here and there, options needed to have some kind of mechanical weight. And so her idea was that you would bump up to the next die. And that, I think, really revolutionized how we were playing the game, how we could design mechanics. Because I think before that, the idea would just be edge and snag, which is exactly the same mechanic as advantage and disadvantage in 5th edition.
And that certainly added a level of depth of what you could do with things like equipment and specialization skills and helping each other out.
Yeah, and the equipment is one of the chapters that I championed, which was supposed to be a G.I. Joe chapter. Like, I didn't expect the G.I. Joe version of equipment. Like, I thought that how a weapon works would be carried over to all equipment, but I didn't think that requisitions and all of the like multiple layers to the equipment system that I wrote up for G.I. Joe would be the basis for how equipment worked in all of the systems. I thought that was just fulfilling a G.I. Joe need. But yeah, the idea of like effects and then having an alternate effect but it has a downshift, but it's better. Like that all came from Page's idea of having upshifts and downshifts, specifically because it was easy to see where upshift fit into the system. You needed upshifts to show that you were better at something, even better than your training may suggest. And then we had this cool downshift mechanic and far fewer implementations because no one would take an option to take a downshift unless there was some kind of reward attached to it. And the most logical place to put those rewards was in the weapons and having, some weapons having multiple effects. But the reason that it's not the default effect is because it is harder to get that to work. You need to be more trained with this weapon to still reliably use the alternate effects.
And it also helps, as far as I've seen, the GMs manage the difficulties or create more difficult situations. They can say, move forward, but you get 2 downshifts because this is a really bad circumstance. And so it gives an additional level of flexibility in creating that dramatic tension in a scene.
Yeah, it's the definition of a yes and or a yes but, in that it's like, I have this wacky idea, and the GM can say like, it is a good idea, but it is wacky, and so you're taking a wackiness penalty. So take 2 downshifts.
I may have to call downshifts wackiness penalty. That is ideal. Anyway, you were telling a story here about where we were with.
We were somewhere in the Wild West. So
yes,
I'm not surprised
in the
that
Wild West. That's where I was looking.
Lost our bearing because I've kind of been all over the place, as I tend to be. One thing I will also take credit for is that I named most original concepts in the game. So we came into it, we knew that we had the skill dice, but we knew we could do better or worse. So upshifts and downshifts became my idea. And I named the strength, speed, smarts, and social. And I named them all S's because if you have 4 things, they either need each their own letter or all the same letter. I do not want like a Constitution and Charisma are both the C-lettered ability scores in Dungeons & Dragons. That kind of stuff drives me nuts. So I decided that the array of words that fit our 4 categories, which again, we had the themes of what the categories would be. We didn't have the names for them. And so I found 4 S names that worked nicely together. And when you called them your S's, kind of rolled around in my mouth, it's like, that's kind of like essence, which is, the French word for gasoline, and just like an English word for the soul of something. So what if that is it? These are your essences, and this whole game is the essence system. And so I pitched that to Elisa. Elisa took it to Renegade. She came back and they were like, they like essence, but they want to call this the Essence20 Plus system. And I was like, I was on board for Essence. I was on board for 20. But man, that plus, it was like, ooh, no. Like, all the streaming services have started calling themselves Plus. By the time our book comes out, it's going to be like calling something Extreme in the early 2000s. You missed your window for Plus. And the justification was that the plus is that you're rolling a d20 plus a skill die. And so there was a reason for it. But I thought it was like too many breaths to get through the name, Essence20 Plus. And whereas Essence20 felt nice and smooth. And I always do my research whenever I am naming something. I've learned this from times when I didn't. Well, I don't know if you remember when I put out a Kickstarter for a game called Ruthless 86, which was very much like an evil organization. The leader dies, and now everyone has like there's a power vacuum, and everyone is playing one of the people that are trying to take the lead. I was working on this game for like 2 years, and then right before we were ready to start it, somebody else put a game called Ruthless out, and so we had to change it from Ruthless to Ruthless 86. And so I researched it. I couldn't find any other game called Essence. Since the game has come out, someone regularly reminds me, and anyone that has a conversation about Essence20 in the design space, they will tend to come out of the woodwork and say, I've had a game called Essence for years, and it uses a D20. And it's like, I don't know what to tell you, buddy. You didn't show up when I Googled you.
Well, the fact that it comes from the S's, that is like one of those cool little details that I will never, ever leave my brain. And I will try to introduce into conversations, perhaps awkwardly, because it's just that cool.
That's your Scott Pilgrim moment?
It's my Scott Pilgrim moment.
Nice. So, yeah, I mean, I named some other things, but I don't think we have to get into every little thing that I named. But that was how it was going along, and things were going really smoothly. There were some clashes between what the G.I. Joe team wanted and what Elisa and the Power Rangers team saw for the best, and a lot of it was like, I wanted to put in a variety of threats into the core rulebook so that no matter what level you were, we had threats for you in there, including like low-level mooks, medium-level mooks, and even a little bit higher-level mooks, some lower threat level named characters, all the way up to high-level named characters, and I wanted to make sure we put in the trifecta, you know, Cobra Commander, Destro, and Baroness. The idea being that if you are just a fan of G.I. Joe and you know role-playing games, you're picking up this book as a collectible, and you want to see what they did with Cobra Commander. In the same way that you'd want to see what he looked like in a movie, even if you had no intention of seeing the movie. The pushback was that once you give it stats, players will believe they can kill it, and you should not be able to kill Cobra Commander. As long as Cobra Commander is alive, he is a threat in every single campaign. So those were the two arguments. Elisa never agreed with my side of it, but still trusted my take on it enough that we went with my breakdown of the threats. And there were a couple of other things that when we got the template from the Power Rangers core rulebook, the G.I. Joe team was like, but it's missing this. Like, it doesn't really have any GMing information, and it's got these threats, but it doesn't really have the information for how to use the threats and how to read the threat stat block. And our threat stat blocks were more elaborate because they had a lot more steps, and there was concern that it's too complicated, there's too many rules. So that brings us to the release of Essence20. Now, technically, Essence20 came out in 2021 at Free RPG Day. There was a setting neutral, so far the only setting neutral Essence20 release, called Enter the Collection, which I always thought was clever in that, you know, Essence20 is tied to all these toys, toy collectors, you know, they have their collection, and in this there was just some like alien race of bounty hunter kidnappers, and you were just like average people on Earth, and you were confronting the collection and stopping them from whatever they were doing. There were some problems with this. I think that this was ready to go based on the original release date plan, which was Gen Con 2021. Problem is the pandemic happened, and as you'll recall, that changed everything. Supply chain issues were the main reason that things were slowed down for us, as well as the change from 5e to an original system. So instead of releasing at Gen Con, which is in August of 2021, everything was pushed to 2022. And the idea was going to be, it was like 3 successive releases. January for Power Rangers, March for G.I. Joe, and then May for Transformers. And Enter the Collection just became an oddity. If you were at Free RPG Day that year and you picked it up, you may not know what Essence20 was, or maybe you picked it up in anticipation of the Hasbro licensed role-playing games, and there were no pre-gens, and there were no rules, and so you'd read the adventure, and then it would tell you, and now fight this guy, and here's his stat block, and you had have no idea what any of that stuff meant. So, yeah, it is a curiosity. It is a collector's item within Essence20 fans, because, again, when it came out, there was little to no fanfare for this specific product, and it didn't get great reviews because nobody knew what to do with it. Nobody could run this adventure. It just kind of got thrown into the back of people's RPG closets. So, in January, Power Rangers came out. And you know how I was talking about all the things that I was arguing for and the G.I. Joe team decided to implement, even though the Power Rangers team had not implemented in their version of the core rulebook? That became an issue. Power Rangers came out and it was not well received. It was tepidly received. It was kind of like people were passionate for this product, and so that passion for it made the problems with it much bigger than they maybe were. I don't want to make excuses for it. I know that there were problems with the game, but I also know that like the response to it was really loud, and a lot of Essence20 hype came crashing down based on this one product release. So some of the issues were the editing was not what it should have been. Some people were saying like, was this supposed to be a beta release? And I can sympathize with them because yeah, it definitely felt like a version before the version that was ready for print. And then there were some other issues of like people did not understand how to read the threat blocks, but also the threat stat blocks were limited in multiple ways. One, there was not many of them. And 2, there was not the range like I was talking about. There were putties, which were the mooks, and they were the only mooks for level 1 to level 20. And then after the putties, it went straight up to like threat level 5, and there was a lot of threat level 5. And then most of the rest of it was in the threat level 5 to 10 range, so it was like you'd have to struggle to figure out what to do for the first 5 levels. Then, you know, you were swimming in it, and then there was nothing. And we hadn't announced that there was any kind of like threat book coming out, so looking on the horizon, people were even like worried, how am I ever going to run this game without enough threats? Had there been threat creation rules, then they could have supplemented that. Had there been a bunch of threats, then they wouldn't have needed the threat creation rules. But the fact that there was neither of those things was a major issue for the playability of the game. So behind the scenes, we scrambled, something I'm good at. And I worried, because I was worried about what this might do to the G.I. Joe release, I offered to design threat creation rules, because we already had threat creation rules. That's how we made our threats. And so I was willing to codify it, write it up as a product, and then we should release that product right away onto, not even as a product, as a free PDF for anyone that bought the core rulebook. That way people could make new threats, and that would cut off one of the major, not just complaints, but one of the major issues with the book. Because Power Rangers, even more than G.I. Joe, like Power Rangers is a monster a week. That's the format. So even worse than not having as many threats as the G.I. Joe core rulebook, Power Rangers would need more than all of them, and some way for the GM to actualize the idea of being the one who's creating these monsters and sending a high concept, vaguely defined monster at the players every week, and writing an entire adventure around their original idea. So the problem was, I'm a professional writer, and I would have to charge money for this writing that I was doing. So I offered them a solution. I said, don't pay me now. This product will one day go into a published product, and it will take up pages of that published product. So pay me when that product comes out based on the pages that I have written, and act as though I've written for that product. We don't even have it on the schedule yet. It may be years before I get paid for this, but we need it now, and I have a solution for how I could eventually get paid for it. So it came out, and as predicted, it calmed a lot of the masses. Now, there were some other issues. Probably the biggest issue is that there was a major push to get the marketing right. So there were collector's editions. You could buy a 6-book set with one for each of the Power Rangers from season 1. Like each one was that color, and then it would have like gold foil of their helmet on the cover, which was gorgeous collector's item with this not quite half-baked, but also not quite ready to come out of the oven version of the rules. And so some people went all in on this and got pretty badly burned. And Renegade did a lot of things as fast as they could to calm everyone down. But it was a rough couple of months. And here I was anticipating the G.I. Joe core rulebook, which I hadn't even seen the final version of it. So one worry I had was that everything that we added in might have been taken out into editing because it didn't match up with Power Rangers. I was a little worried about that, and Elisa even told me later on that it was a last-minute decision to leave Cobra Commander in. So even though he was designed, there was still the possibility that he got cut at the last minute. But no, luckily the G.I. Joe book came out, and it was so much more polished that one of the rumors going around was that Renegade changed the book based on the Power Rangers feedback. But honestly, there was not enough time to do that. It was at the printer. We were already committed to G.I. Joe. Transformers was not at the printer because there had been some issues, so it got delayed. And so instead of just being delayed, it was completely pulled just to make sure that whatever happened with Power Rangers didn't happen with Transformers. And luckily, G.I. Joe came out, and people were much happier with G.I. Joe. It clicked the boxes. It didn't have as many issues as Power Rangers. Frankly, it probably still could have been cleaner. There are some editing issues and whatnot. So my main concern was that Power Rangers' failure was going to take G.I. Joe down with it. But in a lot of ways, the reaction to Power Rangers actually made G.I. Joe look better than it even was. And of the 3 first core rulebooks that came out, I was convinced G.I. Joe would sell the worst because it's, of the 3 IPs, it's the one that had the least juice behind it. But it felt like G.I. Joe suddenly got a lot of goodwill within the RPG community. And there were people saying, if you want to play the Power Rangers role-playing game, pick up the G.I. Joe role-playing game. You will learn how to play the game, and then you can go back and use the Power Rangers options. So it felt great. That was a mix of emotions in those couple of months leading up to that book's release. So when it came out and it was better received than I was worried about, and even better received than I had hoped for, that was really vindicating. I'm going to take a second. I've been talking. Do you have any questions, Charles?
Oh, wow. So many. But the thing that kind of resonates most is this move fast and break things kind of
Hmm.
way that it was built. Like that's how you get a Facebook or, that is what innovation looks like in the modern era. And it's what's striking me is how unique that story is going to be because it doesn't feel like it was governed by a set of rules written in 1972. It doesn't feel like it was really constrained in any way, despite the fact that it was major properties and kind of tied to a very big company. I don't know who will get, other than a very small level, that level of creative freedom. So I think that it'll be a long time before a product like that could ever happen again.
That's a good point, especially when it comes to GI Joe. Like, what even is GI Joe was a question that could have been asked, and because I was brought in mainly as the lore guy, because I had no 5e experience, I still have never played Dungeons and Dragons Fifth Edition, and yet I was brought on to work on a book that was based on Fifth Edition Dungeons and Dragons. But I was brought on because of my lore knowledge, and so yeah, I came in and I really set the tone of like, we want this to be GI Joe, not one era of GI Joe. We want a little bit of everything. So that's why if you look through the active roster at the front where it lists 80 Joes, no one year has their entire list of characters that came out represented, and no year that had an original character released doesn't have at least one character represented. Like there's stuff from the 2000s that we talked about last week. There's a lot of obscure stuff in there. And I just wanted to make sure that I got like a good scattering so that no matter when you came to GI Joe, you could recognize GI Joe in this. And a lot of it actually, I credit to you because of your Ripcord story, where you were saying that the first time you read a GI Joe comic, Ripcord was the main character, and so you thought Ripcord was the main character of GI Joe. And so, and then years later, you compared the barrel roll issues of the Devil's Due comic to those Ripcord issues, and that somebody picking up that issue would be convinced Barrel Roll is the main character of G.I. Joe. And so I wanted to make sure that no matter when you picked up that first issue of G.I. Joe, you recognized your G.I. Joe in this product. With obviously a slant towards the early 80s, because that really was the golden age. But most of those characters have showed up in every iteration since, and so it was easy to favor them while still representing the other eras.
That's awesome. So I guess the question is, you got the book out and a whole bunch of books were to follow, and even MOP was to follow. What happened after the success of G.I. Joe initially?
So that's when we went back to the drawing board for Transformers. Transformers, a version had been turned over. There were some issues to it that were unique to Transformers. Like it wasn't just the same issues as Power Rangers had. We had three different teams all working as one big team. And then when we broke it down to the different books, we all had our own individual team approach. And so that's why we ended up with like three very different feels for the original versions of these books. Also, I kind of feel bad for the Transformers teams because whenever we did a team meeting, we would go in chronological order. So it would be Power Rangers, then G.I. Joe, then Transformers. And so the energy would go down as we dealt with more and more problems. And then we would get to Transformers, who still didn't know how converting would work, which is a pretty important thing for Transformers. And they would usually have the least time and the least energy to deal with their problems. So I'm not surprised that when the book was turned over, it wasn't ready for print. But at that point, because I had established that, like, with the threat creation rules and with how well G.I. Joe had released, I had established that, like, I was really invested in Essence20. I had good senses for how to go with these rule books. And so I offered to do an editing pass on Transformers. They had some faith in me. It was a ridiculously tight deadline. Like, for that book to be out in August, when we didn't know until March that what I had done was working, like, I cannot even remember just how many words I was putting out per day, but it was ridiculous. And so I worked really hard to get Transformers to work. I had to completely rewrite some things. I innovated some things accidentally, which we'll get to in a second. And then I turned it over. It made its deadline. I basically did like an editing pass on everything up to the threats. I had nothing to do with the threats. And then when the book came out, I saw that they had recreated my version of the active roster with like the list of characters at the beginning. That's not something that I had added. So that means that after my super tight deadline pass, somebody had an even tighter deadline pass to make it as much like the G.I. Joe and as much like what was working for Essence20 at that point. So yeah, it is incredible to think of just how many hours was squeezed into how little time by how few people to turn Transformers from what was turned over by the manuscript into what became the public product, which in a lot of ways, a lot of people say is their favorite core rulebook, and I don't blame them. Even though now, like, in retrospect, had I had, more than twice the amount of time that I had, there are some ways that I could have fixed some things, like tying the rules for being a robot to roll doesn't make any sense. It should have been tied to origin. So there's just a bunch of things like that are like, if there was a Transformers second edition, I know what I would do with that second edition. But as it is, the book is good. People are happy with it. So I'm happy that people were happy.
We're running up against having to run out the door to pick up the everybody, I believe.
Yeah.
I am
I can
going
do
to,
just two more quick things. So one of them is
yeah,
the
yeah,
My
of
Little
course.
Pony role-playing game came out after that. And that one kind of was flipped for what my experience with Transformers was. I was on the My Little Pony team with Elisa and Trivia, who were full-time Renegade employees. And then they both left Renegade, and their portion of the book was not done. So somebody else was brought in to complete that project. And so when it came out, there were some changes that were made that, like, I had big plans for these, and it was like, oh, this is different from what I turned over. And after the fact, people like at Renegade were saying, like, we like what you did with this book. We're sorry that some of the sections were not what you hoped they were. But anyway, like, it's not stuff of heavy consequence. It's just, I'll lay it out since I've been alluding to it. I had big plans for how the introduction would be written, in that it would be handwritten notes by Twilight, and they would be real dry and real academic, and then, those would be typed out, and then handwritten notes by Pinkie Pie, bringing the fun and making it wacky and stuff. And like, this was something I worked out with Elisa early on, and like, I had a very specific desire for this. And then we would even bookend the book by, one of the comments in the beginning was like, you can't spell something without role-playing games, or you can't play role-playing games without something. And then the very last page would have a note from Pinkie Pie saying, like, oh, it ends up you can spell that thing without this other thing. And in the editing, some of the comments were like, oh, this is too dry and this is too academic. And so they tried to make it more fun. And it's like, no, it was supposed to be dry and academic because that's Twilight and that's the point. And it was supposed to be this like immersive experience. And so they left in some of the dryness and some of the wackiness of Pinkie Pie, but it just became like this tonal mess. And I was so proud of the voices that I had captured for that writing, and just so disappointed that didn't make it in. But like other stuff that I'm proud of, the spellcasting system made it in, and I still think that is the coolest thing that I've designed for all of Essence20. So it released, I don't know if it ever found its audience. It really feels like, as far as Essence20's future from then, it was the action adventure brands, and then My Little Pony kind of off in its own corner. And I've dipped back into My Little Pony more often than I remembered. Like, there's been 5 releases and I've worked on 3 of them, even though in my head I worked on the core rulebook and then moved on. But I co-wrote the adventure that's with the GM screen, and then I contributed to another book that came out. So I've done more My Little Pony stuff than I give myself credit for, than I remember. And actually, Transformers, as far as published stuff, I've only worked on the core rulebook. And yet, in my mind, I've done more work on Transformers than My Little Pony. I don't know. It's just a way I'm mixed up there.
I'm going to throw it out there that we need to do an entire half hour on My Little Pony, because honestly, I was so not into it at all when it released.
Yeah.
And you're like, give it a try, give it a try, give it a try, give it a try. And it's now probably one of my favorite parts of the system,
Yes,
because it has basically the non-violent resolution.
Yeah,
Because
which we
of
just
course
saw in
they're
action
ponies.
in our game that we play with Eric. He incorporated that. Yes, I have done technically 2 My Little Pony episodes, but there was technical difficulties and I'm not happy with them. So I would be happy to go back and do a My Little Pony episode with you, Charles.
I think that that's probably the next place that we need to go, and a good place to end off this particular one.
All right, sounds good. So before we go, just a shout out. Renegade Con is coming June 6th. So Renegade Con is, actually, I think occasionally it's 1-day event. Sometimes it's 2-day events. And I think this Renegade Con is a 2-day event. Let me just confirm. No, it just says June 6th, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So it is a packed schedule. It is mostly HeroScape. That is that is Renegade's big thing right now. But if you are looking for anything that might have Essence20 product in it, at 11 a.m. Pacific, Renegade new game reveals. Discover new games coming in fall 2025 as pre-orders are unveiled. I have a feeling at least a couple of Essence20 books will be announced then. We'll wait and see. This is the no guarantee because it's an unveiling. You cannot predict what's going to be unveiled until it's unveiled. Then we have a whole bunch of stuff about HeroScape.
Yeah. Even if you know, you can't predict that. They're called NDAs. But anyway, go ahead.
Then we have like 4 hours of HeroScape stuff. But at 2 p.m. Pacific, we have Welcome to Night Vale character creation with Symphony Sanders. So Welcome to Night Vale is an Essence20 product. It is the first non-Hasbro Essence20 product. It is, I believe, officially releasing at Gen Con this year. So by June 6th, when this Renegade Con is happening, that will be very close to its release. So I'm sure the book will be done and at the printers at the time. And so Symphony Sanders will be creating their first Welcome to Night Vale character. I don't know if Carlos, who is the main designer on Night Vale, will be accompanying them. I don't know, but I'm definitely going to be checking that one out. That is guaranteed to be Essence20 content front to back. Then we've got some Axis Allies, Diplomacy, Monsters Menace the World. So that's 3 back-to-back board game related seminars. These seminars are only half an hour each. Usually they're an hour. So I just realized that, which is why I thought it was 2 days because there were so many seminars. Then there's a World of Darkness Roundtable. Naishi Showdown with Ruel. I don't even know what that is, but I will say that at 5 p.m. there's something called the After Credits Scene. Don't forget to stay until the end. Again, I don't know what that is. I don't know if it relates to Essence20. I'm intrigued.
Well, I think they're probably going to find out that it's really hard to talk well about a topic in just half an hour.
What are you saying?
But I'm looking forward to hearing those things too. I think that there's Night Vale is very interesting. It is a completely wacky, insane environment. And if there's any interesting carryover from that to other Essence20 products, I think that we're in for a really wild ride.
There have been a couple of preview pages, and you can feel the tone through those pages. So, I am excited. I'm intimidated to try and run Night Vale because I feel like there's a lot more pressure on the GM for a Night Vale RPG than most other things, just because you have to set up 2 things at the same time, what people think is happening and what is actually happening, all with this like hypnotic tone. Like I'm excited to see the GMing chapter of that book, if not everything else. I think they're actually not calling GMs, they're calling them hosts. In any case, we'll talk about Night Vale in the future, but for now, thank you for joining us for episode 41 of Upshift. You can find more great gaming podcasts and blogs at NoDirectionPodcast.com. Thank you to our patrons. You can find out more at patreon.com/NoDirection. And thank you to Word Burglar for the use of Letters from Snake Eyes Part 4. You can find out more at wordburglar.com. Until next time, I'm Ryan Costello.
And I'm Charles Cushman.
This has been Upshift.